When you think about the conservative political tradition, what comes to mind? A reverence for tradition, a preference for slow incremental change, an appreciation for present laughter over utopian bliss, as the British political philosopher Michael Oakeshott famously put it. From a deep historical perspective, conservatism conjures up images of Burke, John Adams, and Oakeshott. More modern American history brings to mind the eloquence of William F. Buckley, the pragmatism of Eisenhower, the moderate restraint of Colin Powell. Of course, it was never all statesmen and scholars. Think of George W. Bush here. But still, how do we get from there to a party dominated by the likes of Lauren Boebert and Steve Bannon, and of course, Trump himself? Contemporary American right is a clown show. When I saw the bronze plaques that Trump had put under previous presidents, I truly thought that they were AI generated. My expectations of Trump are low, and I still didn't believe that he did that. How far away are we from President Dwayne Elizondo, Mountain Dew Herbert Camacho? But unlike Idiocracy, this clown show is far from funny. In fact, it's growing more violent and deranged by the day. From prosecuting political enemies to writing off entire states as undeserving of federal disaster funds, to authorizing undertrained and heavily armed ICE agents to patrol American cities with apparent impunity, or, as the fascist Stephen Miller puts it, quote, absolute immunity. And to be clear, I'm not letting liberals or Democrats off the hook either. I'll have a video posted about that soon. But to get back to our focus here, what the hell happened to American conservatism? This is a question that many scholars, journalists, and politicos have been grappling with, and there are two broad ways that this question has been answered. So the first response emerges from liberal centrists and conservatives themselves. Thinkers like Mark Lilla, Andrew Sullivan, George Will, David Brooks, David French. Right? And their basic argument is that contemporary American conservatism has strayed far from its classical conservative roots. Building on thinkers like Russell Kirk and William F. Buckley, and pointing to examples of moderate Republicans over the past 75 years or so, they contrast the history of American conservatism with the contemporary variant. So in this telling, classical conservatives have a deep faith in the wisdom of tradition because it represents knowledge accumulated over generations. Changes must be suffered, as Oakeshott put it. When change has to occur, it should be in response to a specific problem, and it should be incremental, preserving the best of the existing order while allowing it to evolve alongside history. So read Burke, for instance, on the French Revolution to get a sense of this attitude towards change. Part of this skepticism towards sweeping change and utopian designs lies in a view of humans as fundamentally flawed creatures. Classical conservatives believe, with Thomas Hobbes, that we should base our political projects, in our political projects, we should acknowledge, quote, what drives most men most of the time, not reason, but passion. A leader's job then is to dampen down the passions that can lead to social antagonisms so that rational decision-making and social cohesion is possible, right? As Oakeshott put it, the man of this disposition understands it to be the business of government not to inflame passion and give it new objects to feed upon, but to inject into the activities of already too passionate men an ingredient of moderation, to restrain, to deflate, to pacify and to reconcile, not to stoke the fires of desire, but to damp them down. Does this sound anything like contemporary American conservative leadership? Trump's inclination is to do the exact opposite of this at all times. So in this line of thinking, the real conservatism of the past is contrasted with populism, with Jacobinism, with the reactionary and counter-revolutionary politics of today. So among these thinkers, there's a recognition that American conservatism has always contained its irrational and demagogic figures, the McCarthys and the Goldwaters. But the point at which the grand rupture with the past occurs is said to be quite recent, over the past decade or decade and a half, with the rise of the Tea Party and he who shall not be named. The second response emerges from the left, perhaps most influentially, the political theorist Corey Robin. And Robin argues in his book, The Reactionary Mind, that while it might be analytically interesting to pick apart different varieties of conservatism and consider their nuances, so classical conservatism, libertarianism, neoconservatism, paleoconservatism, and so on, what unites all of these diverse traditions is that they're a reaction to movements from below, aiming to rid us of entrenched social hierarchies and inequalities. Conservatism is a response, Robbins said, to quote, disturbances in the private life of power. And throughout his book, The Reactionary Mind, he catalogs how, when we look historically and dive into the politics of really nearly any conservative thinker, from Edmund Burke to John C. Calhoun and Ayn Rand to Ronald Reagan, you find that they were on the wrong side of the struggles of their day for justice and equality. So to use just one example here, let's take William F. Buckley, often portrayed as sort of a real conservative of the classical variety, temperate, articulate, dispassionate. But you don't have to look hard to find problems with this portrayal. Take Buckley's admiration of the Spanish fascist leader Franco, who he wrote was, quote, an authentic national hero, who saved Spain from the Marxists and ideologues, and was, quote, not an oppressive dictator at all. It's worth noting that this was nothing compared to his National Review colleague and brother-in-law, L. Brent Bozell, former McCarthy staffer who actually moved his family to Francoist Spain for a time. Or take Buckley's position on fascism American style, the Jim Crow South. The National Review published several now infamous editorials with names like The South Girds Its Loins and, more pointedly, Why the South Must Prevail, where Buckley explicitly embraced the realities of Southern apartheid. I'm just scraping the surface here. Dig into the National Review archives in the 50s and 60s, and you'll be hard-pressed to find a single issue where there isn't someone taking up a position that the vast majority of Americans would now find reprehensible. So, here's what I think. The venerable tradition never totally existed. Buckley and the National Review were racists, full-throated supporters of McCarthyism, and even toyed with fascism. They aren't outliers here. I'll mention a number of other examples over the course of this video. So the absurdity of today's conservatism and even the depth of the rot maybe aren't entirely novel. But contemporary American conservatism is unique in its politics. And looking at the historical variability in conservatism and the evolution of conservative politics helps us to understand both how we got here and where exactly we are. So my way of making sense of this is through what I think of as the four ruptures that distance American conservatism from the more laudable ideals of the classical conservative tradition and from any semblance of sanity. And when I speak of the laudable ideals of the classical conservative tradition, I'm just trying to recognize that reasonable, decent people could hold classically conservative ideas about tradition, about sweeping change, or about human nature. Rupture number one, the rise of the new right. In the 1950s and 60s, the Republican Party was faced with a strategic choice. The Democrats' New Deal coalition had grown dominant, but it was a strange and precarious alliance, comprised of northern labor unions, so-called white ethnics, so immigrants and second-generation Americans from Southern and Eastern Europe, African Americans, and Southern whites. One way to break this coalition would be to appeal to African Americans and racial progressives, for the party of Lincoln to embrace civil rights protections. And it's worth pointing out that this was an argument that young Republican activists of the Ripon Society were pushing. Another strategy, though, would be to break this coalition apart by appealing to Southern whites and a burgeoning white middle class in the suburbs. You probably know which choice the party made. The 1964 presidential election marks a turning point here. There was growing disapproval among conservatives, both from the grassroots and from moneyed interests, about the moderation that many Republican Party leaders had adopted. Take Eisenhower, for instance. In addition to critiquing the military-industrial complex and sending federal troops to Little Rock, he famously defended the welfare state as being good common sense. In a letter to his brother, he wrote, quote, should any political party attempt to abolish Social Security, unemployment insurance, and eliminate labor laws and farm programs, you would not hear of that party again in our political history. There's a tiny splinter group, of course, that believes you can do these things. Their number is negligible, and they are stupid. Barry Goldwater vehemently disagreed, arguing against the welfare state in support of a more aggressive, confrontational foreign policy and a more militant anti-communism. And Goldwater also took a stand against federal civil rights legislation, stating that although he personally supported civil rights, it was a violation of states' rights for the federal government to enforce civil rights protections. So here he's offering a justification for racial segregation using the language of freedom, a militant defense of an unjust status quo using the rhetoric of justice, and an opposition to movements for equality using a Manichaean worldview of good and evil.
I would remind you that extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice.
Goldwater, of course, got his ass kicked in the 1964 election, but his, quote, school of political reaction, as the New York Times called it, was far from over. The conservative columnist George Will would later refer to Goldwater as, quote, the man who lost 44 states but won the future. There's much more to be said, of course, about the New Right, the explosive politics of the 60s, the political shifts of evangelical Christians, and so on. But for the sake of brevity, let's fast forward a decade or so and move on to rupture number 2, the rise of neoliberalism. The 1970s was a moment of political economic transformation. For the previous 3 decades, there'd been a tepid compromise of sorts between corporations, unions, and the government. The agreement went like this. Markets would be the general organizing principle for the American economy, as corporations wanted, but corporations would provide their workers a sizable chunk of the profits that they were making, in the form of higher wages, benefits, pensions, paid vacations, and so on. For its part, the government would provide a stabilizing hand through providing a social safety net, capital controls, even policies like full employment were on the table. In this way, the government was sort of mediating between the needs of capital and the demands of workers. This compromise worked while the economy was booming, but the 1970s saw a marked downturn and several crises, like the 1973 OPEC oil embargo, the related rise of stagflation, and the shift to floating exchange rates. The global economy was also shifting, with transnational corporations organizing global chains of production, the rise of deindustrialization in the US, rates of unionization were declining, and profits were shifting from manufacturing to the finance, insurance, and real estate, or the FIRE sector. These are all complicated, and I'll get further into the specifics in a video some other time. For now, the point is that the political economic system that had delivered so much wealth to both American companies and also many American people was no longer working as it had. For nearly 40 years, wages had grown alongside productivity. Economist Judith Stein points out that after World War II, the economy grew 4% a year, and poor people gained more than the rich. The income of the lowest fifth increased 116%, while the top fifth grew 85%. The middle also gained more than the top. This comes to an abrupt halt in the early 1970s. Wages start to stagnate around 1972, and by the end of the decade, Americans were, generally speaking, worse off economically than they'd been at the beginning of the decade. At this moment, there was a space for new ideas to seep into the mainstream of American politics, and there were moneyed interests who just so happened to have a model for economic flourishing that they'd been peddling for decades. The political scientist David Vogel finds that between 1968 and 78, the number of corporations with public affairs offices in Washington increased from 100 to more than 500. The number of business-related PACs increased from 248 in 1974 to 1,100 in 1978. Over the course of this decade, a whole network of conservative think tanks and trade groups were founded. The Business Roundtable, the Heritage Foundation, the Cato Institute, the Reason Foundation, the Competitive Enterprise Institute. Those that had been around, like the Chamber of Commerce, took on a more aggressively partisan mission, and its membership swelled as well. This new political framework that they were pushing was based on the ideas of economists like Friedrich Hayek and Milton Friedman, and it's often referred to as neoliberalism. The key question for the neoliberals was, how do we make markets the organizing principle for all social life? Their policy prescriptions were as follows: privatize, so schools, prisons, hospitals, energy, social security; deregulate, get rid of environmental, labor, and occupational health and safety laws, which were seen as drags on the economy and in some cases on infringements upon the natural rights to private property that business had; uh, cut social spending, right? Implement austerity programs, particularly when it came to the social safety net, and also put in place tax cuts. Again, predicated on the idea that this actually hampered businesses' investment and productivity. In certain respects, it's fair to say that neoliberalism became hegemonic over the course of the 1980s and 90s, and perhaps even up until the financial crisis of 2007 and 2008. It was the societal common sense for a time. Even many Democrats embraced these ideas, with Bill Clinton famously declaring that the era of big government is over in his 1996 State of the Union address. At the same time, the neoliberal agenda was never fully implemented in the US. The French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu famously describes the right hand of the state, so agencies and departments related to national defense, the military, prisons and jails, policing, and the left hand of the state, agencies and departments related to unemployment insurance, environmental protection, healthcare, and so on. Republicans didn't seek to scale down the state writ large, as a consistent libertarian like Ron Paul might have advocated. Instead, they sought to strengthen the right hand of the state while smashing the left hand. One of the reasons that the right hand remained so prominent was thanks to the rise of a group of thinkers known as neoconservatives. The neocons are kind of a fascinating case study in ideological evolution, because many of them start out as communists. Irving Kristol, Norman Podhoretz, Michael Novak, and some include Daniel Patrick Moynihan or even Daniel Bell in this grouping. But there's a historical trajectory where through the 40s and 50s, they shift from being sort of Trotskyites to anti-communist liberals, and then in opposition to the rise of the New Left, anti-war protests, and the war on poverty in the 60s, they grow increasingly disillusioned with the Democratic Party. By the late 60s, early 70s, some turn into conservative social democrats, or others into outright conservatives. They don't support an expansion of the welfare state. They're particularly critical of the unintended consequences of the war on poverty, which they wrote about in journals like The Public Interest and Commentary. But they're not as alarmed about the growth of the state or about deficit spending as the neoliberals are. Above all, they're militant anti-communists who support a muscular foreign policy. The idea here is that U.S. interests are ideological. They have no boundaries. Democracy is part and parcel of our national identity, and we should be promoting democracy across the globe, both through carrots and sticks. The neocons had an enormous impact on U.S. foreign policy in particular, from Reagan through George W. Bush, arguably even through Obama, and one might argue up to today with recent shifts in Trump's foreign policy. But the conservative faction, whose ideas are most prominent today, are actually the opponents of the neocons, the paleoconservatives. This brings us to rupture number 3, the slow march of the paleocons. The paleoconservatives position themselves in explicit opposition to the neocons and to the neoliberals. And we can understand the paleocons by looking into the ideas of two of their most influential adherents, Pat Buchanan and Sam Francis. Buchanan is the better known among the two, former Nixon speechwriter who hosted Crossfire on CNN and regularly appeared on the McLaughlin Group. But Francis is in some ways the more interesting. Francis was at one time a quasi-reputable journalist for the Washington Times. But I first encountered Francis's ideas about 20 years ago when I was researching far-right white nationalist movements, and I came across a photo of him on the website of a group called the Council of Conservative Citizens, a white supremacist group that evolved out of the racist white citizens' councils of the 1950s. Many of Francis's private writings were racist screeds that I won't read here, published in places like VDare and the American Renaissance. In short, Francis was an overtly racist piece of shit. but he was also kind of a brilliant political strategist, an evil genius in a way. In addition to being influenced by neo-Confederates like the Southern Agrarians, he was well versed in the thinking of James Burnham, who wrote a very well-known book in the 1930s, early 40s called The Managerial Elite. The Italian thinker Gaetano Mosca, who had this elite theory of power, and even Antonio Gramsci, the Italian Marxist thinker, who I think it's safe to say would have found Francis's ideas absolutely abhorrent. Um, but just to give you a little bit of insight into Francis, let's look at two of his more public-facing essays. The first is called Message from Mars, and here he draws on the idea of a liberal sociologist named Donald Warren, that there exists a grouping of Americans that can be thought of as middle American radicals. And this is like an intersubjective temperament that Warren and Francis sees being adopted by many sort of middle and working class people, a sense of resentment, a sense that the existing political and economic structures don't work for them and that they're being screwed over. The second is a related article on Francis's friend Pat Buchanan's presidential campaign called From Household to Nation. The premise in both of these articles is similar. In Francis's reading, the fault lines of American politics are between, on the one side, middle American radicals, who again feel like political and economic elites are dominating political institutions, that they don't work for many Americans, most Americans, who tend to agree more with the left on economics, but more with the right on cultural issues like nationalism and, quote, traditional social values. So this is the middle American radicals sort of on the one side. On the other side, according to Francis, you have a, quote, new class of elites. And by elites here, he's not talking about sort of CEOs of corporations. He's talking more about college-educated, sort of white-collar bureaucrats working for state agencies, think tanks, nonprofits, and also, importantly, working alongside a, quote, underclass of poor racial minorities. So these groupings, the new class and the underclass, stand opposed to middle Americans as well as big business. From Household to Nation, Francis basically argues that conservatives are still seen as more or less elitists, and they have no real grassroots momentum, no social base that can really galvanize a movement. So his strategic question here was, how can conservatives, real conservatives, pull in these middle American radicals? And he says they can do so in a couple ways. One, by protecting workers. So he rejected free trade agreements and globalization, and he argued that, at least in some cases, the right should support protectionist economic policies like tariffs. Second, he said we should withdraw more or less from the global stage. He was a staunch opponent of globalism, of, quote, cosmopolitanism. As the journalist John Gans points out, the Paleocons were not exactly isolationists. It's maybe more accurate to think of them as sovereigntists. They're not completely and totally opposed to any sort of foreign intervention or war, but insist that it has to be directly in the national interests, which is construed sort of much more narrowly than it is for, say, the neocons. The Paleocons are ardent nationalists, and we're not talking about a civic nationalism here, but they're very overt ethnic nationalists or racial nationalists. And in fact, many of them, like I think both Buchanan and Francis, it's fair to say, are white supremacists. And then finally, sort of an extension of this, there's a real focus on immigration and the importance of strong borders. It's easy to forget today that there was once a time where Republicans could be quite sane on immigration. I mean, even as recently as George W. Bush. But the Paleocons helped to pull the party really far to the right when it comes to an embrace of strong borders and an America First, quote unquote, foreign policy. So initially, the Paleocons don't succeed in taking over the Republican Party. They fail miserably. The neocons, the neoliberals, and evangelical Christians remain the sort of dominant ideological forces. But this starts to change around the time of the financial crisis. This brings us to rupture number 4, the simmering resentment of the Tea Party. Now, Francis hoped that the Middle American radicals could turn into a grassroots force on the right, a real sort of populist base. This didn't happen in the 1990s, but it sort of happens after the financial crisis of 2007, 2008. So after the bailout passed under Bush and the stimulus package passed under Obama, the Democratic Party under Obama attempted a few pretty measured incremental reforms. Perhaps we might even think of them as classically conservative reforms in response to healthcare and climate change. But these reforms provoke a sort of outsized resistance, a massive resistance, we might say, whipped into a frenzy by corporate dollars, but with real grassroots support. The Tea Party, in some ways, was the reactionary straw that broke the conservative camel, or elephant in this case's back. Who were the Tea Partiers? According to Theda Skocpol and Vanessa Williamson, in their book, The Tea Party and the Remaking of American Conservatism, these were, for the most part, not working class people who had borne the brunt of the pain of the financial crisis. These weren't the people who lost their jobs and their homes. These were, generally speaking, people who were wealthier than the average American, older, and in spite of their anti-establishment rhetoric, they were already pretty at home in the Republican Party, though their views were more extreme than the average Republican. They embraced a libertarian rhetoric, harkening back to Goldwater, but this, again, was more rhetoric than reality. They were for free markets, but also for law and order. Their identities were wrapped in the flag and the Constitution and structured around a divide between friend and enemy, makers and takers. So one of the cornerstones of democracy is what the political theorist William Connolly calls an ethos of pluralism. So we can have strong opinions and fight like hell to bring about the world that we want to live in, but we recognize that not everyone shares these opinions and that reasonable, decent people can disagree with us. So in other words, we recognize the legitimacy of competing and conflicting views. Our political opponents are not our enemies. With the rise of the Tea Party, though, we start to see the death of the Republican moderate. The John McCains of the party become almost unelectable. They face a Tea Party challenge in the primary election, and the Republican base has moved so far right that the moderates don't stand a chance. And alongside the decline of the Republican moderate, we see the sort of concomitant death of pluralism among American conservatism. So whereas Buchanan failed in 1992, the Tea Party pushes the Republican Party base rightward, allowing Trump to succeed in 2016. So Trumpism is its own strange political project that we can dive into some other time. But this video tried to explain the shifts in American conservatism that have paved the way for the madness that we're seeing today. The new right normalizes extremism in defense of liberty and starts to chip away at the accomplishments of the welfare state and the New Deal order. The political economic ruptures of the 1970s paved the way for neoliberalism, which add insult to the injury of deindustrialization, amplifying the power of corporations while screwing over ordinary people. The Paleocons provide a right-wing critique of neoliberalism in the form of economic nationalism tethered to white nationalism and support for, quote, traditional social values. And finally, it takes the grassroots energy of the Tea Party to pull the Republican base to the right, challenge the party establishment, and open up space for the increasingly violent and deranged politics of Trumpism. That's what I think anyway, but I'd be curious to hear your thoughts in the comments. And here are some sources that I've found valuable in trying to understand American conservatism. So thanks for listening.